Hi, this is Miyake. I'd like to talk about democracy and what happened to Japan in the 1930s. What I'm worried about today is that something similar is happening in this part of the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. Hi, this is Miyake. I'd like to talk about democracy and what happened to Japan in the 1930s. What I'm worried about today is that something similar is happening in this part of the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. Hi, this is Miyake. I'd like to talk about democracy and what happened to Japan in the 1930s. What I'm worried about today is that something similar is happening in this part of the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. Hi, this is Miyake. I'd like to talk about democracy and what happened to Japan in the 1930s. What I'm worried about today is that something similar is happening in this part of the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. Hi, this is Miyake. I'd like to talk about democracy and what happened to Japan in the 1930s. What I'm worried about today is that something similar is happening in this part of the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme.
Synergia Forum number 76, the 12th in our webinar series. Well, you would have seen the topic for today is democracy dynamics in an authoritarian pandemic. A bit of a jugglery of words, but the subject matter of discussion will be looking at China from a Japanese point of view. Well, as bizarre that may sound, but to look and understand China's strategy in a global power game and its efforts to challenge the United States in terms of geopolitics, and perhaps following the path of revisionist in terms of geopolitics, is what we would like to assess and discuss and understand the consequences of, from Japanese diplomat Kuni Miyake, who will be joining us from Tokyo. Konnichiwa, Mr. Miyake, and thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. Well, let me take people, our viewers, through the format that we will be following. The format that we will be following is first, Mr. Miyake will make his speech, and then we have two experts, Dr. Arvind Gupta and Mr. Richard Fontaine, who will join us in making interventions to the arguments or points that Mr. Miyake makes. Mr. Miyake will answer to those, respond to those points, and then we will have a panel discussion which will involve the Synergia Foundation's Major General Moni Chandi and the President of Synergia Foundation, Toby Simon, following which we will have a question and answer session. So the subject matter of discussion today is to assess China's international policy, one of assertions, and it's something that is of particular interest and concern from an Indian point of view, given the standoff that we've had at the line of actual control, and of course, the loss of lives that we've seen at the border skirmishes, unfortunately. Well, so it would be a matter of great interest. We will bring that point in, but we would like to ideally see this from a larger global perspective. We would also like to assess if it is the internal political dynamics of China that is asserting its aggressive external policy at this moment in a post-COVID pandemic world, and where this is going to take us in terms of consequences. Mr. Miyake, as he has mentioned, will be taking a parallel to how Japan approached the global scenario in the 1930s, and we all know where that led the world to. We would also like to, another part of this discussion would focus on democracy and the importance of democracy in a tendency to be authoritarian in dealing with the pandemic at a global level. Is democracy the only insulation from bad decisions and ensuring as an antidote against fatal messaging? So Mr. Miyake, as we know, is a Japanese diplomat who has served as ambassador in China as well. He has a ringside view of his neighbor, and we would now like to listen to what he has to say about China from a Japanese perspective, and give us a historical lens into the present. Mr. Miyake.
Thank you. Good morning in Washington and good afternoon in India. And this is 10 o'clock, not midnight in Tokyo. Well, thank you for inviting me, but probably you invited a wrong person, because I was a diplomat. I used to represent my government, my country, but not anymore. I'm retired. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar. So I don't know why you asked me to talk about history, but I have to, because you asked me to do that. So allow me, I'm not representing anybody. I'm just representing myself. But what I like to talk about is what's happening in East Asia. I think in a nutshell, the conclusion is we are getting back to the 1930s. It is an unpredictable, those years are also unpredictable with full of uncertainties. You know, politicians continue making serious mistakes for that entire decade. But there's a similarity between the 1930s and now. Look, there's a rising new power, a rising power in East Asia, considering that the power of the United States is declining. And they believe that the status quo is unjust. Because it is unjust, it should be corrected, it should be rectified, it should be changed, even by force. And the rising power challenged the hegemony of the US in East Asia and the Western Pacific, and then challenged the Americans. It was Japan in the 1930s. And something similar is happening, I'm afraid, now in this part of the world. I hope I'm wrong. At that time, Japan has no democracy. And probably that's the reason why we made a historical mistake. And in a nutshell, we failed to control the military. There was no concept of civilian control at that time. So democracy is not a silver bullet, doesn't guarantee any perfect solution to anything. No, it only guarantees maybe in the long run, looking back, oh my God, we didn't make a fatal mistake. That is democracy. Autocracy may guarantee some short-term effective solution, but it's not going to work forever. So we didn't know that. So we lost democracy and we challenged the US hegemon. And unfortunately, we made a big mistake. So what I'm worried about is that we are getting back to the 1930s. The Cold War era, despite all its uncertainties and probably difficulties, it was a stable era. And now, after the Cold War is over, the world became more and more unstable. And especially in the 21st century, we are getting back to the 1930s again, I'm afraid. So what I really don't want to see is our big neighbor, giant neighbor, will not repeat the same mistake as we made in the 1930s. A rising power, considering that the United States is in decline, and we thought that the status quo was wrong, therefore it should be corrected, it should be changed, it can be changed by force, and we challenged the American hegemony in the Western Pacific, and we failed. Why? Because we could not control the military. I hope they are not repeating the same mistake as we made. I don't want to talk about a lot because this is all I could say about the history. And I'd like to close my remarks and I will get back to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miyake. It was interesting. You see, the reason why when you had suggested that we would draw a parallel between the 1930s of Japan and what's happening today, we thought it would be a very interesting historical perspective to share, both as a diplomat who's seen Japan and China and the Middle East and other countries in terms of the global power equations right now, a matter of concern. May I now invite Dr. Arvind Gupta to first share his observations on the point raised by Mr. Miyake about a parallel between the 1930s Japan and what we're seeing in China today, sir.
Yeah, I believe I have only about 2 minutes.
No, you can go ahead, sir. Okay. You can make your point as long as it takes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Miyake, for raising this very important question of the rise of China and its conduct and behavior. You went back to 1930, Japanese experience, and this is very informative what you just told us. The point I want to make is that in history, revisionism has been quite common. Let us also recall that the United Kingdom, Britain, was a superpower, a major colonial power for a very long time. And ultimately, it was displaced by the US. And when the US came, into existence in 1776, its first task was really to challenge the existing order, though it took almost 100 years or even more to really come to that stage where it could challenge. So I think the power equations will keep shifting, democracy or no democracy, and the countries will make decisions about challenging or not challenging based on their comprehensive national strength, their national character, political systems, and so on. So we have also seen even before democracy. I mean, democracy is relatively a new thing. There has been rise and fall of civilizations. Civilizations have come and gone. Challenges have come and gone. So I think this is a natural flow of history that power will shift, power equations will shift, and challenges will arise. Sometimes they will succeed, and sometimes they will not succeed. So that is the first point I want to make. The second point is about the stability of the Cold War. Again, Cold War was a very complex phenomenon. And I think the view about Cold War will depend upon from where you are sitting and how you experienced it. So you have given us the Japanese viewpoint, but from the Indian viewpoint, for instance, Cold War was not a particularly good period. In fact, we had to carve out a policy of non-alignment. We were very worried about the military blocs. We were concerned that the nuclear weapons or the mutually assured destruction, kind of a deterrence that could destroy the world. And we had to cut ourselves off from the global economy, and we became quite inward-looking at the same time. And particularly the proxy wars which were fought during the Cold War, one for instance in Afghanistan, and that is in fact in a way still continuing. So the situation in Afghanistan is quite unstable, and we have had a terrible price to pay. So it all depends upon the perspective about Cold War will depend upon how you experienced it and where you were. And third, I want to talk about now the China challenge to the status quo. I think if you read about Chinese progression, let us not forget that it was the US, in order to fight the USSR, which encouraged China, and you had the famous Kissinger visit, and of course the normalization of relations between the US and China. And if you read Michael Pillsbury and many other books that have come out, the Chinese rise is quite often is attributed to the US tolerating it and overlooking the lack of democracy and many other things, essentially for geostrategic purposes. And of course, we have also seen how the US-Japanese relations are shaped up in the 80s, and the Plaza Accord, and the US worry that at some point of time Japan may challenge US itself, and particularly in the financial side, you had the Plaza Accord, and the Japanese had to upvalue their currency, and that led to the lost decades and so on and so forth. So I think China today is in a situation where it has given up the sane advice of Deng Xiaoping of keeping your head low, hiding your strengths and biding your time. And I think it started with really Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping has really carried on with those policies, and he has become even far more aggressive. But the logic which the Chinese have given, that they would never accept the hegemony of the US. And they also have this historical logic of the century of humiliations. I think this plays very well with the Chinese nationalism, and that's why you have China Dream, the construct of Xi Jinping, which is essentially a nationalistic construct. And today, in the post-COVID era, many countries are beginning to look inwards because globalization has been disrupted, and the benefits of globalization were not equally distributed, and inequalities in the world have arisen. And with some headline or the most important aspects of globalization have been disrupted. And this has created a new thinking So you have the disruptions in the global supply chains when the medicines were not available because the global supply chains were passing through China. And today there is a whole lot of rethink as to how the new world order will shape up. So China's assertiveness is certainly a matter of great concern. But we are also seeing that there is very little consensus in the world as to what to do with China, what to do with this, Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness, which is on display, be it in East China Sea, be it in South China Sea, be it with respect to Malaysia, an island which is 2,000 kilometers from the Chinese shores in Natuna, and that is where with Indonesia they are fighting. And then, of course, you have what they are doing in South China Sea, something like that they are beginning to do on the India-China border as well. So I think there is a pattern to China. Now, whether the Chinese will succeed in this is still a question whose answer is not available. But the fact remains that there are many fault lines within China. The economy is slowing down. The party has to continue to deliver high growth for a long time for it to remain legitimate in the eyes of the people. There is now social discontent also in China, which is often which is suppressed. So I think China's challenge and China's aggressiveness, it may have chewed more than it can digest. But nevertheless, it can create a huge problems with their neighbors, and we are certainly experiencing that. So with those remarks, I will stop and we'll come back in Q&A when if it is okay. Thank you.
May I just take a question from what I heard from Dr. Arvind Gupta to Mr. Miyake? I think the most interesting part was, what do we learn from the way the world responded or reacted to Japan, in the way the world should be reacting to China today? Is there a question there, Mr. Miyake? And would you just like to quickly weigh in on that remark that Dr. Arvind Gupta, former Deputy National Security Advisor in India, Government of India, and the President of the Vivekananda Institute has made? The Vivekananda International Foundation, I'm sorry, has made.
Could you repeat the question, please? Because I might have missed it.
The question, Mr. Gupta, as part of his intervention to the comments that you had made, but the point that Mr. Gupta made is that we really don't know how to react to this, to a strategy by China. So do we have a lesson from the way the world reacted to Japan? And
China is, of course, India is a great nation, big nation, but for us, China is too big to contain. The rest of the world, China is too big to contain. So I'm not talking about containment. We must engage them. We can deter them, but we cannot contain them. You know, Japan at that time in the 30s was just 1/10 of the size of China now. So that's why it cost us a lot, but we learned the lesson. Now we are a democracy, and we know how to behave. But unfortunately, this country, our neighbor, is so big as that probably it would cost 10 times more than it did in the 1930s.
Right, thank you so much. Mr. Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security and former foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain as well. He joins us, of course, the author of, hello, can you hear me, sir?
I can, yes.
Yes, right. I think the frame just froze there. So thank you so much for joining us on this, sir. Would you like to bring in a comments? I would also, after you make your comments, I would like to refer to an article that you've written on Foreign Policy Magazine, which I think has relevance to the conversation that we're having. But first, would you like to make an intervention to what Mr. Miyake and Dr. Arvind Gupta have said so far?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thanks to the Synergia Forum for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be on with my friend Kuni. So it's good to see you. I would just briefly make 3 points. 2 areas in which it seems to me that the experience of Japan in the 1930s is dissimilar to the experience of China, and then one where it is quite similar. The first, where I think they are unlike each other, is in terms of the internal decision making of Japan in the 1930s and China today. In the 1930s in Japan, if someone said, "Who's in charge? Who's the one person who's in charge? Where does the buck stop in terms of Japanese decision making?" It was always hard to tell, because you had the Showa Emperor Hirohito, who would intervene from time to time, but often was aloof from the decision making or just in general approval. You had a prime minister, you had the army, and you had Army-Navy rivalry. So you had these different sort of power centers. And even when you got to Tojo Hideki as the prime minister, you still had a somewhat fractured decision making, and the decision making ultimately, even the surrender decision, was made by the cabinet, and then when it split, sort of forced through by the emperor. So you didn't have one place where the buck stopped, and that creates a certain number of challenges. In China, it seems to me it's just the opposite right now. Xi Jinping is clearly the preeminent leader, the president for life, and actually China and Beijing have moved away from their pattern of more collective decision making over the previous decades to having one person, still collective, but one person at the end of the day in charge. The second area in which it seems to me that things are somewhat different is the role of formal colonialism, the formal control of territories outside one's borders. Of course, Japan had acquired Taiwan in 1898 and then Korea in 1910. But the push to Manchuria and then the rest of China, and then obviously in Southeast Asia, was very much about matching the other imperial powers in terms of the acquisition of colonies, the raw materials that one could get, forming a trade bloc and so forth. In China, you see a much more open and kind of diffuse way of projecting influence. One, it's not limited to just its own neighborhood. Two, it's much more economic rather than military projection of power and take over things. And it's much more diffuse. And so, countries can find Chinese influence in one area of their economy or their society and not necessarily in others. And that makes it both more complicated, in some ways more challenging. One area where I do think that there's a similarity is with the military approaches. If you look to Japan's military approaches in the 1930s and then into the first half of the 1940s, the aim was to control certainly areas around the Chinese and East Asian mainland, and then key islands, so as to push the defense perimeter constantly eastward and deny access to the U.S. military so that it couldn't spoil the plans that Japan had within that defense perimeter. And actually, you see today a similar kind of approach with China, both the combination of activities and militarization in the South China Sea, increasing its relationships in the South Pacific, its investment in missiles and other anti-access area denial capabilities that all are designed to push American sort of area of safe operations, military operations, further and further away, so as to deny America a spoiler role from the Chinese perspective in having a dominant and more influential role within that perimeter. And that, I think, is actually very similar to the Japanese military playbook in the late 1930s and 1940s. So with that, I'll just offer those thoughts and look forward to the discussion.
That's very interesting. Do you want to comment on the similarities that he's pointed out, Mr. Fontaine has pointed out, Mr. Miyake? You have to unmute yourself, sir.
The biggest similarity, I think, is the nationalism. The nationalism, we couldn't control it, and the military used it, and this kind of nationalistic sentiment is everywhere, and especially in China. And they are just trying to overcome their historical sort of, what can I say, trauma of 1840, the Opium War. So they are kicking the Brits out, they kicked the Portuguese out, but now still the Americans are stationing in the old Chinese sort of traditional sphere of influence. And that this is the most dangerous thing and most similar sort of aspect between China now and Japan in the 1930s.
Right, the core of it vis-a-vis the similarities in terms of military structure. So I would like to ask Mr. Fontaine, I was reading your article on foreign policy written with Daniel Kleeman, and I'd like to quote you from your article, and I just want you to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that Trump should shape the project, I'm talking of the Belt Road Initiative, through engagement and pressure, and direct and outright opposition is doomed to fail, you say in your article. When you're talking of engagement and pressure in an approach as a response to what you see from China, where would you believe that the key focus should be for the rest of the world in terms of that engagement and pressure? How do they draw the line? Does that change in a post-COVID scenario? And who needs to start this process of engagement?
Yeah, so this article was about China's One Belt, One Road projects. And our starting point was to say that it is not going to work for the United States to go around to countries that are in need of infrastructure of whatever kind and say, no, don't take aid from or loans or support from China. Just don't do it because it's a bad idea. That's going to be a non-starter for many countries that in fact are in great need of funding, however derived, for their infrastructure, just for the welfare of their people. And here, in terms of the engagement and the pushback, a lot of it depends on what it is we're actually talking about. If China wants to build a bridge in some place, okay, fine. If it wants to build a surveillance architecture, a technology surveillance architecture in a place, that's a very different kind of question. There's a difference between building a 5G network in some place and building, a light rail place or a dam or something like that. So there are areas in which, and particularly in the technology space, China's One Belt, One Road project has this effect of projecting illiberalism because of the values embedded in what it's doing. And those are the areas where we believe we should push back the greatest. But ultimately, the challenge for the United States and for Japan and for India and for others is to be able to offer reasonable alternatives to countries. And what is not going to work is for the United States or anyone else to try to match China dollar for dollar and things like that. But by helping to mobilize capital in the private sector, by providing technical assistance to countries so that they can adequately assess the kind of contracts that they may or may not be getting into, by sharing information about how other countries have either benefited from or not benefited from One Belt, One Road projects. Those are the kinds of things that we have in mind that can be a realistic response to One Belt, One Road.
Right. So try and bring in a process of engagement and pressure at the same time. Carrot and stick together is the way you would like to see it.
Yes, exactly. But always in the realm of the realistic, not a stick that tells countries that it's by definition bad to accept One Belt, One Road projects from China, nor to just ignore One Belt, One Road projects with China, but rather provide alternatives and narrow the focus of ones that we find particularly problematic. For example, the sort of digital Silk Road stuff.
Confrontation and conversation have to go side by side. Well, I want to quote Dr. Gupta from the article that you've written on the Vivekananda International Foundation website, which I saw on the 18th of June. A couple of points that I thought were very interesting, which could possibly add, and I would like you to expand on those things, on those 2 points. The first one is you mentioned how the Singapore Prime Minister has mentioned that Asian countries should not be put in a situation where you need to take sides in a US-China China game. And the second point that you also point out is that the assertiveness of the Chinese could have a lot to do with the way the Chinese internal problems of the way the government had handled the Wuhan crisis and possibly a weakening weakening situation in the power corridors at Beijing. Could you just explain a little bit more on whether this is, are we looking at a concerted strategy of being revisionist at a global level, or is it something that is getting provoked by an internal issue as well in China? What would be your understanding of the situations?
Um, I think there is a internal political dynamic which is playing out in China, which is not very well known because China, not being a democracy, it is difficult to fathom as to what's going on because this party structure is essentially a dictatorial structure. It follows a certain rules, and in that structure, the party and the military are very important. And no leader in China can survive unless it has a complete control over the military. And from time to time, tensions do this relationship. And that is why Xi Jinping has now practically, he wears all the hats, including the chairman of the CMC, that is the China Military Commission, Central Military Commission. What I had in mind was that in the context of the India-China standoff, one of the statements which is being played up and which is a very harsh statement is that of the Western Theater Commander, Shuli, I think is his name. And he has, and he's probably the rank of a major general in our system, perhaps. And the People's Daily and many other media are quoting him again and again. Now, one of the possibilities is that she, in order to keep the military happy, is giving them a lot of flexibility to deal with the various issues that have arisen. Whether it's in South China Sea or now in the India-China border, and giving them certain flexibility to deal with the situation. So the local commanders, although I think there is a well-planned strategy that Chinese have activated the entire India-China border, almost 2,000 kilometers of it, and at several points there is a lot of mobilization that is happening a little bit far away from the line of actual control. But we can see that at least 2 divisions of forces are there. Now, this is really will keep the military happy. And this brings me back to Mr. Miyake's point that in these troubled times, and particularly in authoritarian states, military becomes very important. And Xi, who is now already under pressure for not having handled the COVID crisis properly, and for the economic downturn, now he is also open, many fronts. He has to keep a control over the military and keep them happy. So this was the point that I was making. About the second point about the Prime Minister Lee's point, which is in an op-ed that he wrote in Foreign Affairs recently. Now, this is also some kind of a wake-up call, because he is saying very clearly, don't put us in a situation where we have to choose between the US and China. So for ASEAN, US provides a certain security, but on the economic front, they are totally dependent, they are interlinked and interconnected with the Chinese. And with South China Sea, South China Sea is almost becoming like a lake of the Chinese. There is no way in which the ASEAN countries can really stand up to China. So they don't want to be in a position. So I think even for Indian policymakers, this is a very important moment when the ASEAN will say, look, if it is between India and China, please don't ask us to take sides. And China, by having focused on the Belt and Road Initiative, and which is essentially not just about building a bridge or a road or an infrastructure point, but I think there is a huge strategic intent behind it, which is really to emerge as the provider and increase its influence in all over the world and challenge the US. The US is at this point of time, this blue dot and the high quality infrastructure, I think, which the Japanese are talking about, it has not really taken off as yet because the money is not there. On the other hand, China is going with loans, although those loans get them into trouble, but China is going up with the loans and many people are ready to take those loans. And China is not getting into any of these human rights issues, corruptions, etc. They are happy to fund any dictator in Africa or anywhere else. So I think there is a Chinese strategy. So I think the main question that is now that we have to face is Chinese conduct is obvious. How they are doing it is obvious. But what is it that the rest of the world should do? The rest of the world, when it should be coming up with a concerted strategy vis-a-vis China, we find there is a massive problem between Europe and between the US. So I think the rest of the world is going through a lot of turbulence of its own. COVID has decimated globalization, many economies, and they are not able to put that their house in order and come up with a concerted strategy. And China is taking advantage.
Right. I'd like to bring in the Synergia Foundation's Major General Moni Chandi as well, who's been writing extensively on the confrontation between US and China, and also the confrontation between India and China as well. Major General Chandi, would you like to weigh in on with your thoughts on what you think the way forward is, and also from a global perspective? I wish we had a Chinese voice to sort of give us an insight into what's happening behind, dare I say, the Iron Curtain. No, but from Beijing, but no, we don't have that. So Major General Chandi, could you give us a more of a rounded perspective on what's happening around the world?
Thanks, Veera. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You've given me a very challenging task, but Synergia Foundation takes pride in being impartial. And to talk about China at a stage when we have just lost 20 soldiers on the border is painful. But since we are an impartial foundation, I'll try and be as impartial as I can under the circumstances. I like Mr. Miyake's presentation. And it's always interesting to draw parallels from history so that we don't make the same mistakes again and we can learn from history. So I acknowledge the fact that Japan in the 1930s and China in the 2020s, there are lessons which we can learn from it. But at the same time, we've got to realize that 90 years have passed and the world is very different from the world it was in 1930. I think that, our population is unparalleled and we have a global community which is interconnected and knowledgeable and aware of what is happening. So to that extent, it's different, but the underlying perceptions are very much there. And as I heard the speakers speaking today, I acknowledge three factors which is causing us concern. The first is that China is a rising power. And they have been steadily rising over the last 3 or 4 decades. And there is a new balance of power in the world. And with the COVID pandemic, that transition has been accelerated. So I acknowledge, and as a foundation, I think we recognize that. The second aspect, which I feel is, wasn't mentioned in so much detail, but I think it's a matter of concern that there is increasing nationalism across the world. And it's not just confined to autocracies or democracies, even democratic parts. Well-developed democracies are facing this problem of nationalism. And when you weigh the challenge of nationalism, there is an undermining of multilateralism. So as we see this transition of power, I think it's interesting to take another parallel from history. And that is the liberal world order, which was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Cordell Hull at the end of the Second World War, was based on certain very fundamental principles. But maybe it's time to think, have they failed to deliver after 70 years? The first area where I see a failure to deliver was in multilateralism. The multilateral institutions which we have across the world, are they really representative of China and indeed India in the new order of things? The second challenge which I also see is that, was democracy overrated? When you look at the American involvement in Iraq, or you look at the American involvement in Afghanistan, or in Syria, was democracy the only way forward? Are there other forms of governance which can also provide stable administration? And it's interesting to note that the People's Congress of China is the largest representative body which tries to make law. So does a form of government other than democracy as we understand, is it capable of providing leadership to a world? Having said that, there are four important takeaways that I take away from this discussion. The first, as I mentioned, was, has democracy been overrated, and are there other forms of government which can give us peace and stability? The second is, has multilateralism, the way Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Cordell Hull visualized, failed to evolve the way it should have evolved? And is there a correction that we need to make there? The third is something which was not mentioned but was highlighted in an earlier Synergia presentation, and that is the global financial system. Are we facing difficulty there? America has plenty of dollars. US is a debtor nation. The dollar keeps appreciating. Somebody talked about a Bretton Woods 2.0. Is it time to think about that? And the last takeaway that I have is that in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia brought peace to Europe. And Westphalia was based on sovereignty and the recognition of a national government to be responsible for the behavior of its citizens. But in an increasingly integrated and connected world, is there a need for Westphalia 2.0? So those were some of my thoughts which I had on the basis of this.
Gentlemen, do you guys want to quickly respond to that, to the comments made by Major General Chandy? First of all, starting with you, Mr. Miyake, he's asking you the question, was democracy overrated, though your argument is that's the only insulation against fatal messaging. So you'll have to unmute yourself, sir. That's
For
the only way
me,
we can hear the Japanese voice.
personally, well, I don't represent my government, but democracy is a luxury. Okay, it's very precious, and not everybody can get it. You can try it, but in our case, this is it's not the first time for us to exercise democracy. We had in the early 20th century, we had the period of Taisho democracy, and we experienced that before, and we lost it. Then we regained it in 1945. But in other countries, I don't want to name, if you don't have enough experience, for example, maybe some nations in the Middle East, they had the whatever spring in the Middle East, it didn't work.
Right.
So I hope the democracy prevails in the long run, but probably it's so difficult. Not everybody can do it.
Right. Quick comments from you, Dr. Arvind Gupta.
Quite agree with Major General Chandy that we need versions 2.0 of almost everything. So whether it is multilateralism or it's a global financial system, because all these are under pressure. So yes, we require that, but how do we reach there? That is a big problem. We have had in the past, when the First World War ended, and with that ended the 19th century. 19th century ended in the 20th century, actually. And we had 30 years of experimentation, the interwar period. And nationalism rose its head there. There were some halting steps towards multilateralism through the League of Nations. It didn't work because the United States didn't join. And then we had a system in 1945, which is the Bretton Woods system and the UN system and so on and so forth. But it also kept so many people out. I mean, it created a system where you had the victorious powers, and they had all the say, and they constructed a system in Bretton Woods system and other, and they controlled the financial system. So I think that ran for a while, and now we have major problems. As I said, globalization, which brought in some benefits, but which brought in huge inequalities. And you have to read Piketty's book, and you have to see what is happening even in a democratic country like India, where inequality is rising. So I think capitalism has, which is what globalization, the basis of that, it requires a makeover. But how will that come about is very difficult. And during this period, you have the Chinese and the others will just come in and try and assert themselves. So multilateralism, and I think we need some new principles. We need to include some new principles for which the West may not be ready. Today, we have to also acknowledge that democracy is also not uniform. In India, democracy runs a little bit differently than it is in Europe or that in the US, and even Pakistan calls itself a democratic state and so on. But I think today, when the world is so fraught, and here I want to just in one sentence, I want to mention one meeting we had with Prime Minister Abe in Tokyo in 2017 as a part of a seminar which the Tokyo Foundation and some other foundations had come together on democracy and Asian values, which was attended by Prime Minister Abe. And this was a part of an initiative of Modi and Abe on Hindu-Buddhist Samvad, which has been going on since 2015. And Prime Minister Abe told us at a dinner that in a G7 meeting, they said that, we have same values. And what are those values? Christian values. Mr. Abe has to say, no, I'm not Christian, I'm Asian. So I think there is something called Asian. There is a certain Asian experience of democracy also. So we have to become more inclusive. Right. So this Bretton Woods system, global financial system, the United Nations, etc., it didn't go that far in fostering that inclusiveness. So unless we become inclusive, I think the faults of the old system, the old world order, are now there for us to see. But how to repair it is a big question. Thank you.
Richard Fontaine, do you want to take the last word on democracy at the moment? And are we having a blind spot here? I'm punning from your book title. Are we having a blind spot here on democracy?
Well, I would pick up on what Mr. Gupta just said, and I think it's absolutely right that there are varieties of democracy. There's Indian democracy and Japanese democracy and American democracy in various forms, Taiwanese, European, and all of them are different in the execution and the models and the processes. But ultimately, all of them find the legitimacy of the government in the consent of the governed as measured through periodic elections and enshrine some basic rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, things like that. And there we have to draw a pretty bright line between the claims of the recent claims, for example, of Beijing that says, well, we have our Chinese version of democracy. See, we have an assembly that passes laws, except that assembly is told what laws to pass by the party, and then they just pass them. It's a rubber stamp legislature. In the Chinese constitution, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly are guaranteed, but try to exercise that in China and see how those constitutional provisions actually obtain. And I think even in North Korea, there are guarantees in the North Korean constitution, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, things like this, which I think speaks to the universal appeal of democratic values. But there's one set of countries like the Indias and Japans and Americas and Taiwans and so forth that exercise their democracy, their fundamental rights and values and systems in slightly different ways here and there. That's a very big difference between claiming, as the Chinese are starting to do now, that, well, theirs is a version of democracy as well. That their version is as legitimate as democracies, that I guess Chinese people, because of their culture or because of their civilization, should not actually enjoy the same rights that we do in other countries.
Right. Thank you, Richard Fontaine. Before I invite Toby Simon to make his final closing remarks, we've got one question from Lieutenant General Rajesh Pant of the National Cybersecurity Council, who's tuned in, who's responded with this question to the conversation that we've had. Why is it that some of the most vocal democratic nations do not display a similar attitude for supporting the concept of a global democracy as symbolized by the United Nations? It's an interesting question on the topic that we've been discussing. You want to take that, Richard Fontaine, and then I'll just give the last word to quick responses from the three of you on that question.
Sure. I think there's a natural, there's the philosophical explanation, and then there's the sort of everyday practical explanation. The philosophical explanation is that there's not a world constitution. There's no social contract between a world government and the citizens of the world. There's no elected officials in the world to run, but that is true in national democracies like in the United States or India or Japan, where there is a social contract between the elected national leaders and the people, and you can throw those leaders out if you don't like the way they're governing. They are held accountable. So that's sort of the philosophical thing. On the practical side, I think that most people, and I think you're seeing this even to some degree in Europe, which has tried to dissolve some of their national identities in service of the European Union, they define their moral community in national terms. Nationalism has become a bad word, but patriotism is still a good word. And people are patriots. It's hard to find someone who's a patriot of the world as opposed to a patriot of their country.
I just remember, I think Oscar Wilde in his conversation with BBC in 1930s explains the difference between patriotism and nationalism, one as being an offensive strategy and the other as being a defensive one exactly. That is more. But thank you so much for all your thoughts. I want to invite now Toby Simon to weigh in with his closing remarks, though I think both a democracy can, democracy can throw up dictatorial leaders, and hopefully, in the case of China, we'll have a dictatorship with at least a democratic decision-making process for the rest of the world. Toby, would you like to weigh in with your final comments?
Sure. Thank you, Veera, for a wonderful moderation. And I wanted to thank all the speakers, especially Kuni Miyake-san, Dr. Aravind Gupta, Richard Fontaine, and General Chandy for the wonderful insights. To me, if I just sum up, democracy will remain a challenge in the coming future also, more because of the shrinking nature of the pie that we have, where, as we all know, that a few percentage of people is owning a larger chunk of the assets. And this is also, sort of triggered by the fact that we have more technology companies in play and they are owning a larger share. This is causing a lot of discontentment among people, and this is also leading to the rise of either we call nationalism or fundamentalism, because people are finding at a local level in their own countries that they have not progressed in the last 40, 50 years. There was a study in the US that in the 50 years that has passed since 1950 or 60, the average living standards of the American has not increased, of the average American. The rich has become richer, the poor has become poorer. And I think this is generally true in most countries. And so I feel that we need to be very mindful of this as we plan our national strategies. Otherwise, we will perhaps be looking more at things in the surface and not looking at what's beneath the surface.
Thank you so much, Toby. I just have a small correction, Richard Fontaine. I think what I meant was George Orwell's 1945 essay. I got the name wrong there. So on national. Thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing your insights on this issue. Well, let's hope that the past, as Mr. Kuni Miyake had pointed out at the start of this conversation when he was telling us and Toby Simon what he would like to speak about, that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes with the present. Hopefully the rhyming wouldn't be too loud, given the kind of comparison that he's given to 1930s Japan and to the China of today. Thank you so much, Dr. Aravind Gupta, Richard Fontaine, and Kuni Miyake for joining us on this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Major General Moni Chandy and Toby Simon as well. And thank you all for tuning in to this Synergia webinar.